Welcome to Love for Life, the podcast for modern couples who want to build relationships that last while raising families that thrive.
We're Nichole and Ben Farrow. Nichole's the expert and I am the other half of this partnership, bringing the everyday perspective of a guy doing the work alongside you.
Every week we cut through the BS and give you the real tools for real life, because your relationship isn't just personal, it's the foundation for everything. Let's get into it.
Welcome back to the Love for Life podcast. This week we are talking about endometriosis because it is in fact Endometriosis Awareness Month and so many people have no idea what it is. In fact, 62% of women aged 16 to 24 have never even heard of endometriosis. 56% can't name a single symptom, and yet 1 in 10 women suffer from it globally. That's 190 million women worldwide. And I have to say, this one's personal because I am one of them. You may have seen recently, This is Endometriosis won a BAFTA, which is another woman's experience of the condition. I am nowhere near as bad as that, but it is something that's difficult to live with, and it is something that we need to talk more about. And given the fact that it is in fact Endometriosis Month is why we're doing this episode. I'm going to be joined today by a very special guest, Lorna Driver-Davies, who we've had on the podcast before, talking about women's hormonal health. Lorna is a clinical nutritional therapist. She also specialises in women's gynecology and hormonal nutrition, and she's been specialising in endometriosis and hormonal health for 15 years. So she's absolutely the person who can tell us all about it. We start off by asking Lorna to explain what endometriosis is. Lorna, welcome back. Thank you for coming back onto the podcast.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here, especially given the fact that this is absolutely your area of expertise. So there's no one better to hear from on this topic for Endometriosis Awareness Month. And what's really struck me in terms of doing research for this is that 1 in 10 women of reproductive age suffer with endometriosis. That's roughly 190 million women worldwide, yet 56% of women cannot name a single symptom, and 62% don't even know what it is. So before we start, can you just explain what is happening inside a woman's body when they have endometriosis?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that it's a disease, and the best modern understanding concept of explaining it is that you have to imagine that it's systemic and whole body, which means that, and I will explain the simple version, but we are almost coming to understand that it's possibly lots of different types of conditions and diseases under one umbrella. So because there are so many factors that make it come about, if that makes sense. So I think it's understanding that it's so far reaching, and therefore that's why its effect kind of ripples through the body, rather than just thinking about it being an issue in an isolated area and then that's kind of it. Does that make sense? So I think to begin with, the wording is to think it's a whole body systemic disease. Yes, you've got locations where it appears in the body, but its effects have a greater magnitude than that, and it creates this really big whole body burden. So a simple way of explaining it is that you have endometrial-like tissue that settles in parts of the body that it shouldn't be. And most common areas are the organs and tissue that you would find in the abdominal cavity here. And that's the most common. So it can affect things like around the ovaries and the uterus. And then also common areas would be involving things like the bowel or things like the bladder. But you get very weird, but does happen, places like the diaphragm or the spine, for example. Much more rare, but also does happen. But most commonly, everything that you would imagine is in that kind of reproductive organ area, including also, therefore, the digestive tract as well. And then what happens is that tissue settles there, and it's not supposed to be there, and creates lesions, which I kind of explain almost like if you were to get a cigarette and to burn your skin, you would have a burn like that. Or if you caught your hand kind of on the catching it on the oven when you're taking some cookies out or something, you would what a burn looks like that. They kind of look like that on the inside, and depending on how old they are and how long they've been there, they can also vary in terms of how they look. And you can end up with things called chocolate cysts around the ovaries, so endometriomas. So you get different slightly variations of what that looks like, but they still fall under the umbrella term of endometriosis. And I think the key thing is to understand is that possibly more women would have the potential to have endometriosis, but the immune system extremely early on will go off and clear those cells that are not supposed to be there. So there's no concept of, in fact, probably an easy way of explaining it is if you imagine how plants will grow because seeds have been scattered. If you imagine the difference between scattering seeds that just never take hold, they just never become a plant, versus a fully fledged plant that ends up as a tree or a bush or whatever. So it's almost like in lots of circumstances we would imagine that you would see higher rates of it, but it just never occurs basically. And those lesions are very inflammatory. They also cycle with a woman's menstrual cycle, so when she has her period they also kind of react, which is also why, and we'll get more into that, some of the more conventional treatments around helping with it would be to not have a cycle. And I think it's also important to understand is that yes, we're looking at a big proportion of population of women who are in that reproductive category, but endometriosis also occurs in perimenopause and also in menopause. Less commonly so, but it does. And women kind of had it treated in their reproductive years, and it can in some circumstances come back in those perimenopause and beyond years. And we can go into that if you have questions about that, but that's just to kind of give a time scale.
That's really interesting because, as I mentioned at the start of the episode, do that every time. Ben always tells me off because I always hit the mic with my hands because I talk with my hands. So this is really personal for me because I have endometriosis. And actually, I have to say, Lorna, you have been amazing in supporting me through what I've been doing in endometriosis. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I was under the impression that actually one of the cures for it, if you like, was going to be that when I go through the perimenopause and the menopause, that was going to kind of solve the problem. But from what you're saying is actually it might not, because it's not just something that is for the reproductive years.
Yeah, because you've got all kinds of other types of changes occurring as you go through the years, where essentially the perimenopause and menopause years, the perimenopause years is to take you into menopause, which is to be non-reproductive. But what happens with that is you've got major changes with your hormones, big changes with the immune system, because I think early on we need to say that when it's discussed, it's talked about as hormonal disease or condition, whereas I think we need to reframe it as understanding it's a really complicated immune issue, and that's an entire kind of rabbit hole in itself. And women are very wedded to the immune system for all, you have just to have a period, your immune system has to go into inflammatory state in order to shed womb lining. When women go into labour, that involves the immune system. So we're, in a funny way, we're much more wedded to the ebb and flow of our immune system than even men are, for example. And so those changes where the hormones change then can affect also whether endo appears initially for the first time or there's a kind of a recurrence. So in my line of work, actually, because I do a lot of work in those life stages, you'll hear a lot of discussion around endo and the menstrual years and fertility, which is obviously very important, but I'm very passionate about also making sure that women who've had it previously when they're younger are not at risk for it coming back when they're older. And also then managing their hormones, because if you're told your whole life, like, lots of estrogen is bad for endometriosis, and then suddenly you go into the years where you could do with some estrogen, it's a bit of a head bend. So I work a lot with kind of like those transition years as well. So you have these lesions, so they can be in different locations, and that's where there's all the issue around all the pain, all the inflammation, and the knock-on effects kind of that. So it's very, very demanding on the body. It's very nutrient hungry. If you think about having those lesions that aren't supposed to be there, it's highly taxing. The body will be constantly focusing on trying to manage that, meaning that it's not necessarily leaving you with the resources left, so like nutrition, etc., to look after things like your brain, your hair, your energy. So that's where it's felt as the concept of what's the endo itself doing, but then also women will report other types of issues, including other types of gynae issues. I mean, women who've got endo could have PCOS, for example. Fibroids are really common. They might have other types of immune issues, and you and I were discussing you having quite extensive adhesions, which is where you've got organs and tissue that are stuck together. And anyone who's ever done some home craft, who's accidentally stuck a bit of a finger together with some super glue and gone, oh dear, picking it off, you know, organs and tissue on the inside do not like being adhered together. And you know what's interesting is that in some cases you could argue that the endometrial lesions themselves are not so bad. It's when they then turn into an adhesion, and for some women they will find major relief from the surgery, like, you know, really highfold, because that surgeon has been really skilled at releasing those adhesions. So that's also, you get these ultra knock-on effects on all these different types of levels. Also, where your endo is located and the severity of it and how much you have, like a little or a medium or amount, is totally variable in someone's experience of how they feel and the pain they have and other types of symptoms. So it's not a hard and fast rule saying someone who's got a little amount is not going to feel very much, or someone who's got a lot is going to have the worst time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the time for diagnosis, probably because of the fact that, as you say, it does affect the whole body, and it doesn't always grow in the same place, and it could be lesions or it could be adhesions. There's so much to it, and as you say, it can also be linked to, you know, it's been linked to autoimmune conditions. It's so difficult to get a diagnosis, and for so many women, you know, the average is 8 to 9 years for a diagnosis of endometriosis. Obviously, you've kind of explained as to why that is. But if there's a woman sitting here listening to this going, I don't know if I have it, you know, what are the symptoms that women should be looking for?
Yeah, and what I often teach actually is being really clear on what is considered the NICE guidelines. So these are like the official guidelines that an NHS GP, because that's quite often where you would be starting. For most women, some women might get lucky in that they can go to a route where they go straight to see a gynecologist rather than going through a GP, but for many women who are listening, that's going to be the route. So if you are, first of all, if you have strange symptoms, and some of those are going to also be menstrual related, and the reason I say strange symptoms is that some of the endo symptoms you would not necessarily relate together, because we're looking at symptoms which go beyond normal concept of, say, period pain. So if you look at the NICE guidelines, and perhaps in the show notes we could add those, but it's good to be really aware of those, because if you're going to talk to a GP, you might be going in and talking about period pain. But some of the reason that women don't get a diagnosis early on is because they don't then talk about the other symptoms. And also that GP you might not be thinking endometriosis, so you might want to go in and say, look, hey, we could all be wrong, but I just wanted to go through whether you think I actually match up some of these NICE guidelines. Okay, so we'll start with those. So you have menstrual pain, which is considered to be affecting your quality of life. And I think the important thing to say on that is that lots of women will get by on using painkillers, which I totally understand. And I think also some women are absolute heroes and will put up with a lot of menstrual pain that is really now going beyond what I would call normal everyday dysmenorrhea. That's a formal term for period pain. So particularly if that's involving where you would be really doubled over and not being able to move very easily. If you were quite immobile, women feel very sick and will actually vomit. Fainting, that is not normal period pain. Let's just be really, really, really clear. And also women who would be taking normal painkillers like paracetamol or ibuprofen, and the period pain is still really quite bad. So I think if you're falling into that category, that would be like number one. So also, are you off work quite a lot? Are you cancelling going to events? Do you end up having to look at your social work diary and your periods are so bad that you're like, oh, I can't, you know, do a podcast that day or have a dinner party? So if you're actually in that, so that would be probably, you know, number one. The next one would be painful sex. That is in my line of work, I would say, is a strong indicator. But that would, I would say, and by the way, you don't have to have all of these together. So this is why it's worth going through the checklist and thinking, well, I don't have that, but I might have this. Then you've got issues around your bladder. So, you know, painful urination. I would say very common that you get lots of infections. So a proper infection for, say, cystitis, but also interstitial cystitis. And that is where sometimes some women, periods might not be so bad, don't have painful sex, but they end up having to go through the genourinary route and neurology, which is a long route to then get round to the fact that actually you've got endometriosis on your kidneys or bladder, for example. Another one that is going to be super common is going to be anything involving IBS, bowel type symptoms, so pain or major discomfort when passing a bowel movement. And that one's a tricky one because women can also say that they've got IBS type symptoms at other times of the month. So by the way, we're talking about these symptoms not just before or around your period, we're talking about at other times. And so it's like taking those guidelines, but also I'd make a diary. And so you might consider that they're very bad around your period, but you might also find that another one would be also pain around ovulation, because that can be an indicator that maybe you have an endometrioma. So this is endometriosis, which is on the ovaries, if that makes sense. So that's actually why it's good to make a bit of a checklist, look at those nice guidelines, and then also a little bit of a diary, and then you take that to your GP. And in the nicest way, and I work with lots of GPs, I've got friends at GPs, so I'm not trying to rubbish GPs, but GPs, they're busy, they've got short consultations with you, you're not talking to every single GP as an endo expert, so in a way, try and be kind and go to them, not necessarily bringing a stack of paper like this, but just saying, look, I've looked at the guidelines, I've been tracking my cycle, I've been looking at other symptoms, and things I would add to that would be that you are also often quite unwell, but to the point where it's like you are often off work quite a bit, or you find that you're constantly sniffly and that you pick up infections, because that's a really common one. Women, for example, who their glands will go up before their period and during that time. So this is where you have to get really good at tracking symptoms, things like migraines and headaches with those other types of symptoms as well. I mean, I can go on kind of forever, but those are the first things I think to get kind of really clear on.
It's so interesting because as you're listing all of those off, I can say yes to every single one of those.
Yeah.
And I didn't make the connection. I found out about my endometriosis because we wanted to have a baby.
Yeah, exactly.
And I had a chocolate cyst. Which they found, they actually thought it was a pregnancy cyst, and then they went back and realised that actually no, it's a chocolate cyst, so therefore it probably is endometriosis, which has actually sort of meant that I'm very fortunate. I haven't been in the 8-9 year cycle of trying to figure this out. I've been about 2 to 3 years, which is a lot less time, and in that time I've had 2 surgeries. To try and treat the problem. But certain things like you're saying about sort of urine infections and things like that, and I had loads of those when I was younger, and I didn't make the connection. Why would I?
And totally. When I take case histories, it's really common for women to say that they've had lots of infections. So then you see high antibiotic use. So that is often a bit of a giveaway when you put it all together, basically. Yeah.
But this is the thing. I think what you're saying is sort of being very aware of your body and seeing the impact that your symptoms are having throughout your cycle, because I think the other problem is that we do normalise the pain. I mean, I've always suffered with my periods from the moment of having them, and I went on the pill at 13 to deal with my periods, which I remember we had a conversation last year talking about teenage girls and their menstrual cycle, and the fact that we were all just sort of put on the pill as sort of the solving everything. And I was sort of a bit cross about that at the time. But since recording that episode with you, I've actually discovered that that's probably what's enabled me to have children, because had I have not had that, I think my endometriosis may have been so bad that I wouldn't have had that option.
That's
because
true.
It does actually stop it. So I'm actually now really grateful that was the default option back in the day. There's just not enough information out there, I think, and enough research that's done into women's health, and it's looking at all the symptoms and understanding them, because as you mentioned earlier, they can also be really linked to your autoimmune disease.
Absolutely. It's very, very common in endometriosis that you either already had some kind of coexisting immune kind of like basically in not necessarily autoimmune always, but in the immune kind of category. So either another condition or disease, or you've got markers that might come up. So an example would be something like you've already got thyroid issues going on, but it's turned into being an autoimmune type of thyroid disease. And that's really common, for example, in endometriosis. Or there's some kind of you might see like Crohn's or you know, or psoriasis. And as I was saying earlier on, because it's very whole body, can you imagine having untreated endometriosis and then you already have another serious condition or disease? This is where the body's only got so much it can kind of deal with all at once. But the research is really interesting because it's like looking at these interconnecting kind of almost like overlapping areas of going, does that also show us how these things develop, because they start to have overlaps with each other? But yes, you are, you know, a lot of the work I do is wanting to get women who really well, who've had endo and had it treated or in the middle of that, etc., to then be less likely to go on to develop more other types of immune issues later on. Otherwise you just collect them like, you know, Chinaware.
I guess you wouldn't know this unless you keep a diary, unless you're aware of the impact that it's having, because I think it's so easy to normalise period pain. As I said, I've always had bad periods, so to me, having a bad period, that's just how periods were. I've never known any different.
I think it's also then going, if I've got that, what else do I have going on? And women, by default of the system that we have in place, will often only go and get things checked out because they're looking to get pregnant. So I think my message is to say is that if you have issues with your menstrual cycle, but you have other symptoms that I've just listed, or you can, you know, associate being very unwell, that we're moving way out of I'm just having a bit of a crappy morning because I've got period pain, going, gosh, I wonder what is actually going on here, which is a separate subject to you even thinking I'd like to have a baby next year. Because I think the earlier that we look at these things, and I tell you what, and this is no dig at aesthetics because I love makeup and looking lovely, and you and I love looking lovely, but the amount of energy that is spent on women talking about skin creams and the next newest serum and the best straightening irons and the ideal lip plump, the amount of energy spent on that, which by the way is all great and I'm here for it, but almost to take that same concept of you would want to put your best foot looking good, and we're kind of like thinking ahead all the time in that way. Think also, what else could you do as a kind of wellness MOT on yourself, which is a separate subject from thinking about fertility, because also the tricky and sad thing is when they're rolled in together, stressful, as you know, because if you find out that you have endo as a separate subject from fertility, you hopefully have probably got headspace to deal with it, take it on board and think, what can I do, what am I going to be doing and things. If it's rolled into then wanting to get pregnant, it's all shuttled together, it is much more full on, and depending on what age you're at, you might also then be thinking, I need to get on with this whole thing. Yeah, and the body does get very ravaged by untreated endometriosis. And so, you know, you want some time to sort of rebuild yourself. So that's why I'm saying the earlier that you find out, the better, and almost like apply the same amount of energy that you would to thinking about other like nice things in life, like clothes and makeup and all those things, and apply it in the same way of going, this is just an extension of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And interestingly, you mentioned sort of the beauty products and things like that. Are we seeing more endometriosis now because of our environment and because of those types of products? And what do we need to be aware of in terms of trying to protect ourselves? Because endometriosis has been there in previous generations, but is it a case if it's never been really talked about, or there was no sort of treatment for it? I mean, interestingly, I have since found out that I am the third generation of women in my family with endometriosis. And even I was talking to my stepmom the other day, and I didn't realise she also had endometriosis. And back in the day, the treatment was a hysterectomy, which both my mum and my stepmom and my grandmother...
Or you were told to get pregnant.
Yeah. I think at the stage that they found out that they had it, they were sort of early 40s. So all three...
Later on, yeah, sure.
Yeah, all three women were given hysterectomies as a way of treating endometriosis.
Yeah, yeah.
But since then, the next generation, the generation I'm in, has also experienced endometriosis. And I have to be aware that I have a daughter, and 51%... it's estimated that 51% is hereditary. So there is that sort of element. But then there's also questions around our environment and the products that we're using.
Yeah. I'll just comment on the family thing first. So we know that there's an official recognition of there being a genetic aspect. And I wrote a chapter in a professional textbook looking at a case, and I chose this particular case. So this was a real client of mine. With her permission, I explained everything I did with her, but obviously her name is hidden. But I chose her because I called her the sister factor, because she had 2 other sisters. And what was fascinating was this client of mine is endometriosis plus autoimmune thyroid disease. One of the other sisters had lupus. Lupus is partly connected to estrogen. That's another autoimmune condition. And then her other sister, so I think, and then the other sister also had thyroid issues, but also she had a type of reactive arthritis that you would also call autoimmune. So you've got these 3 sisters who have variations, but major overlaps. So they've all got some kind of inflammatory immune-based issue or disease that's looking a little bit different in all of them, and actually 2 of them have the thyroid issues. And then they think their mother had endometriosis, but this client is in her 50s and the sisters are around that age, and so the mother now, it was through them asking her certain questions, but she's traditional Catholic housewife from Ireland that wouldn't have talked about menstrual issues, so they kind of figured that out. And so definitely, and if you ask lots of women who've got endo, they will tell similar stories about, I think my mum had it, or they'll say I've got it and so does my sister. I have a friend who recently was diagnosed and her sister has it very badly, and she thinks she has it mildly, which means it would never have been seen because it wasn't really an issue for her until actually perimenopause for her. So that's a real thing for sure. And then going on the environmental thing is again is fully kind of recognised. This is from the aspect that we have chemicals in our environment which can mimic estrogens in the body, and then our body thinks they're real estrogens and then ends up kind of engaging with them. And then also other types of chemicals which would go on to affect the immune system, and just that's a complicated area, but that's very recognised. I would say what's interesting is that our awareness around chemicals that are not good for us, I think, is getting better. So I think it's difficult to say that I don't think there's more endometriosis now because there are more issues with the environment. I think that we're understanding it better, and I do think women are much more conscious about trying to limit their exposure to chemicals. And by the way, not just for endometriosis, for any other types of hormonal situations. If you are looking for a healthy, good life, we want to try and limit exposure to these things, anywhere. I mean, even on completely separate topics, if you're talking to somebody around things like brain health or ADHD or autism spectrum, we're also having the same conversations about not wanting to expose, us to chemicals. And certainly there's a lot of data and information around chemical exposure to fetuses. And certainly when you're going back to origins of endo and how does it begin, and that's variable, you're going to get lots of cases where there's going to be changes in the womb when a baby is growing, and this will indicate that female will end up with endometriosis, and partly that can be from effects from the environment and from toxin exposure. So I think what's difficult is when they do studies, they tend to need to focus on ones that have a very strong connection. So there are some good studies looking at dioxins where they can make a relationship between high dioxin exposure area and then rates of endometriosis. Otherwise, the problem with chemicals is that we get an onslaught of them that are mixed together. So I think the data is not always as good as it could be, but I think the overall thing is to say is that you're going to be looking after yourself better if you limit that kind of exposure, for sure.
What sort of things should we be cutting out or be aware of that are not good for us?
My big one is really limiting how much exposure you have to plastic, and just even like simple things where people, I do not demonize ready meals. You and I were talking about this, like, if you're busy and you had surgery recently, and I was saying just get ready meals, just put them in the freezer, but take them out of their plastic packaging and put them into glass cookware or ceramic or something like that, or heat them up on the hob so you're not heating plastic. I only have utensils in the kitchen that are wood or stainless steel. So stainless steel, wood, ceramic. Don't use non-stick pans. The non-stick pans one is interesting because it says don't use them if you're pregnant or And I was like, what if you're not pregnant? It's not you. But luckily, I think you probably know this anyway, don't you? That like non-stick pans got such a bad rap over the years that they're making their exit out of a lot of households. So plastics, and also what's great now is you get lots of BPAP plastic, because we do need to use plastics like packaging up food and things, or babies' bottles or babies' spoons. So those are like my major areas. And then, you know, I think I'm pretty good. I'm not holier than thou, but I go out of my way to make sure that I have natural shampoos and conditioner, natural soaps. If I've got like a special night out, and I've gone to an event, I will cover my head in hairspray and not worry about it. So that's why I'm saying, I think if anyone listening, it's not to get neurotic, it's to be thinking you're doing this stuff like 90% of the time. So in my bathroom, I would say everything is very natural, but yes, I have a couple of absolutely chemically products because they make your hair stay up, but I'm not someone who would put those things on my hair every single day, if that makes sense. And all my face creams are natural. But yeah, you know, I've got makeup that's not all natural, so because not all of it's very good. But I think it's trying to cut down, but again, don't get neurotic, for example.
Yeah. I've definitely gone to war with plastics in this house.
Yes.
As Ben will tell you, but given the fact that I have endometriosis, he does not argue with me.
You don't argue with a lady with endometriosis.
No, exactly. He knows to leave that well alone. So, because you know, I've got glass chopping boards now, and the sound is horrible, but we have to just live through it.
Not wood.
Well, we have got some wood, but then it's the treating, and it's fine as long as you treat it, but there does come with an extra level of sanitization that you don't necessarily always have time for with the kids and everything. So it's just easier to just have glass because then you just know that it's wiped clean. Yeah. So yeah, we do have some wood, but mostly it's glass for everyday use. And his argument before was, but the knives, I sharpen the knives and you cut on glass. Like, don't care. So yeah, he's just learned to just deal with it and sharpen the knives.
Yeah, sure.
It's a small price to pay. So what about diets? Because I have heard, and you'll be able to tell me whether it's true or not, that having a gluten-free diet can help with endometriosis. What can women do if they have got it to try and manage their symptoms?
Gluten is probably one of the ones that I am actually most strict on. So I try not to be strict about any food that's good for you, because I think that's a good principle in my line of work, because we don't want to be taking foods out that are good for us that isn't necessary. And what can happen in endometriosis is that it gets really overwhelming. So you start like taking this food out and that food out, and then you're not left with very much to eat. And now you've got food stress or dysfunctional eating. Gluten, I do strongly feel though, the data is not that great for endo. There are not that many studies, but a better way of viewing it is if you look at autoimmune condition and disease studies, those are very strong. And I think to defend bread and pasta for a second, the problem is not so much that wheat from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago is not what we have now. So partly because we had World War II, we got in Canadian type grains, which were much more resilient, so you could grow them much more quickly. So we lost a lot of our old crops that were much better in terms of a symbiosis with the body. So you've got much more like mass produced, and then GM crops, and then also chemicals involved with it. So I think that's why if you look back in time, we wouldn't have had problems with gluten, and we do now, which is not just to do with, say, thinking about the flour itself in that way. We're thinking about the types of strains, GM cropping, and then also chemical processing. So that's where I'm actually quite strict, and it makes a big difference. Where it comes to foods, like people always ask me about things like dairy or red meat, for example, those are absolutely individual for the person. So, and also dairy comes in different types of categories. So again, that can be a little bit of a trial and error. And also there are studies to show that in endometriosis, removing dairy didn't make a difference, or that some people actually did better on dairy, because the nutrients within the dairy are important to actually balance the body if you have endometriosis. So there's some interesting studies with nurses on those. And then with red meat, I think there's a huge difference between looking at, say, processed red meats and then having really good quality, grass-fed steak or lamb, for example, and considering, another hallmark of endo is very, very heavy periods, so you've got nutrient loss like iron, magnesium, etc. I would rather that women are having good quality red meat to get some goodness back into them and some nourishment, considering they're often very tired, exhausted, and low on essential vitamins and minerals. So this is where actually you have to be so careful about removing things. But you might talk to someone that has got endo, he says that they feel much better if they don't have red meat or any meat at all. So this is, you have to be very careful about thinking the diet has to be right for that person. Overall, anti-inflammatory diets are going to be absolute king or queen of that. And then you're going to have variations in that. And some of them can be a little bit more extreme and do have good weight behind them, like things like paleo autoimmune. Obviously, when I mean anti-inflammatory, gearing it towards being more like Mediterranean diet. You've got diets like low FODMAP, which would be there if someone has potentially got bacteria in the small intestines, which is really common in endometriosis, by the way. So that's why low FODMAP diet can be helpful, but you have to go and treat the bacteria for it to go away. You can't stay low FODMAP forever, but that's a commonly used diet, for example, and does work, but it's not a treatment, if that makes sense. And I'm very interested in the kind of cutting edge science now of looking at endo from a metabolic perspective, almost like if we understand that PCOS is a type of metabolic syndrome. PCOS is in some ways in a Venn diagram has a lot of overlaps with endometriosis, and one of those would be that there is a metabolic aspect to endometriosis, which is why things like looking at blood sugar and glycemic health kind of comes in. So I do a lot of that type of work with women around that, and that really helps as well. So people ask me about things like keto, intermittent fasting. So my reservation with those types of diets is that the data is often actually more on outcomes in men, and women have to be careful with things like intermittent fasting because you can end up upsetting your menstrual cycle and other types of hormones. So it can be helpful as part of an anti-inflammatory type approach, because essentially the concept in that is that if you've got longer time without food or you've got controlled eating windows, it allows the body to then go away and do other things when it's not having to deal with processing food. When you've got food going through you, your body's pretty focused on that and doesn't allow the immune system to go and do types of repair activities. So there's a lot to be said about having long gaps without food, and people can feel, this is why you'll get people who might say, I feel better if I haven't had any food, but then I also don't feel great because I feel a bit weak, etc. Yeah, so again, that's why it's working with someone who's an expert like me, rather than just going off and doing these things and thinking that's the right thing. And by the way, you can tailor intermittent fasting to women. That's a different way of doing it to men. And keto for women, if you do it for too long, it can affect the thyroid. So you can take good things from all of these types of areas, and I think it's about putting it into what makes sense for woman A is not maybe the same thing for woman B. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I have seen a few people talking about intermittent fasting, but having it sort of centered around the menstrual cycle as opposed
Absolutely.
to
Totally.
kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, being like in tune with your cycle, etc., and what's kind of going on and when it makes sense to do things like that. And then also, look, we live in the UK, so we have seasons here, and I think some diets are really difficult to do when it's cold and it's wet, whereas we shift our type of eating in the spring and the summer. So again, a bit of concept around not punishing yourself that you need to be eating a certain way on a cold, wet February day,
Yeah, definitely. And actually, when you were saying about, I mean, I really enjoy the Mediterranean diet, but not so much in the winter. As you say, you're wanting something that's warm and
talking in Mediterranean, and I always get teased for this because I go on and on and on about it. I think I'm a bit famous for it, but I'm obsessed with oily fish, and us Brits are not good fish eaters, and we're not good oily fish eaters. But there's so much fantastic data around looking at all kinds of gynae health and all types of immune and autoimmune conditions, but also endometriosis. The thing about also when looking at research with omega-3 as an example, So you might find a paper with omega-3 showing that it's able to control a particular inflammatory cytokine, a compound basically in the immune system, and that some of those will correlate back into those ones that are most common, for example, that you would see in endometriosis development, or something that's fueling the disease. And so you don't always have a paper that would put the two things together, but scientists like me will go, well, that will control that particular cytokine, and I would like to control that in endometriosis. Omega-3 is obviously amazing anti-inflammatory, so very important for things like pain, controlling inflammation, very important for balancing your sex hormones, really important for the immune system in general, and then just overall, like, your brain is 60% fat, we need it for our skin, we need it for our eyes, it's hydrating. If you've got clicking joints and you're 30 something that feel like 60, you might look at, and this is not saying like a little bit of your sushi with your lunch break, which is what some people's concept of oily fish intake is 2 or 3 portions a week that are decent sized portions. So 1 can of sardines, or two kind of 2 bits of mackerel in a packet, nice big fat salmon steak. So these are proper decent portions that we're just not so normal and fashionable in our British diet. So again, don't punish yourself. If you aren't up for eating oily fish, then please supplement a good fish oil.
Yeah, really good advice. Because as you say, it's food often is what we feel like eating as well. But so what you're saying is that actually not necessarily there is a particular diet that's going to solve your particular endometriosis if you have it. Gluten-free is one that you would say supports certainly the anti-inflammatory.
Yeah. Important to understand that just because you go gluten-free, if you've got active endometriosis and nothing else is being dealt with on that one, you may notice nothing. So I think it's understanding it's contextual, and I think that is the problem where these endo diet like sound bites get taken out, and then no wonder someone else would go, well, what a load of rubbish. So I think it's contextual.
Yeah. Makes sense. And I guess what keeps cropping up as we're talking is the fact that there is just not enough research into this area. There's not been enough money spent in women's health overall, but particularly endometriosis, because it's so broad as well, and because it can affect so many parts of the body and have so many symptoms and affects women at all different stages and ages of their life, that actually there's so much more that needs to be done in this area in order to really help women in dealing with it.
Yeah, definitely does. Yeah. Absolutely, yes.
Well, hopefully podcasts like this, and I know there's been a film made about it, will hopefully raise some awareness in terms of women trying to find out a bit more about it. Because as I said, I think we do normalise a lot of our pain and a lot of our symptoms. And I know we talked last year, as I said, when we were talking around kind of the menstrual cycle, that I get really angry at the kind of adverts that are just put in a sanitary towel and it doesn't stop you doing anything and you can just get on with life. I think we've normalised the fact that we shouldn't allow our menstrual cycles to slow us down or to need some time, and that you just sort of carry on, and actually it's not always the case.
No, but I think to add to that, if you think of the sort of historical aspect of it, we went from maybe the concept of women need to hide away, not do anything when they've got their period, to then I feel like these started in the 80s. These adverts of women like playing tennis and stuff, and partly that's also because the technology around the way that the shape of sanitary towels. You talk to like your mum or something, or my mum, and they'll talk way more about leaking. So a lot of that advert was almost like you can wear like a short tennis skirt and no one's going to see, you leaking on your period. So I kind of get that side. But actually, where we've gone now a bit, we've gone so far the other way. Like, I'm just having my period and I'm just going to take the whole day because I've got really heavy flow and like my pain is really bad, but I'm just going to give myself that time. Right, well, that's for some of those cases, they've now moved into normalization of extreme issues. Yeah. Because it goes too far into that, like, no, you're not like the girl playing tennis on the tennis court, kind of honouring this so much that now we've gone over the edge. Women will give me a list of those things and go, yeah, but don't worry, I'm really good because I like make sure that I like just spend half a day in bed. Don't worry, I work for myself, so I just take a day off work. And I'm like, this sounds pretty bad. I think you've over-normalized it.
Yeah.
They've over-normalized it so much that they've now almost lost sight with this has become abnormal, if that makes sense. You are not in a great place. You not being able to move all day long and throwing up, but don't worry, you took the day off work, is become a kind of toxicness in itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And actually, I know that I do that. I work for myself and I pull back, particularly from social occasions. And it always seems to be the case that there's always a social event and it's always something where I'm going to go and do something with friends or something for myself. And that always seems to fall and gets arranged for when I'm on my heaviest days of my period and I have to cancel because I'm so exhausted and I'm so heavy and I'm in so much pain and it seems to always, I don't know, it probably doesn't, but it feels like it always falls on those times.
Yeah, I was talking to someone recently about not endometriosis, but heavy periods in perimenopause, and she'd really over-normalized basically turning the bed sheets into a scene from the Godfather film. You know, there's like the horse's head and like. And I actually had to say to her, you now have very bad menorrhagia, like you have menstrual flooding. This is an issue. I would like you to go and speak to your doctor. Let's look at progesterone for you because that can be helpful. It would be good for you to go on some short-term medication to stop the periods being so heavy because you have such intense nutrient loss that you look like a ghost after that because you've had everything sucked out of you. And she was just normalizing it with, well, I wake up 2-3 times in the night, change my pad, go back to sleep. And she'd normalized that because she'd read on Google that you can get heavy periods in perimenopause. That's what I mean about the risk of where we've got to now. And the sweet thing was that I said to her, what's your husband said? Because obviously he's sleeping in the bed and he'd been really kind and he'd been like, oh God, I'm so sorry that your periods are so heavy and must be really difficult. So he was being so sweet that he didn't even go, this is not good. And I was like saying, you need to tell your husband that this is not normal. He's a lovely husband. And then apparently he then said, my God, if I'd known that actually that was over the top, because men are not going to know normal menstrual flow unless you're normally having a conversation with a doctor. So yeah, I think we need to come back to the normal middle.
You touched on a really good point there about partners, because men don't have menstrual cycles, so perhaps don't know what normal is any more than you do. As I said earlier, like I've always had heavy periods, so to me a heavy period is my normal.
Yes.
And I'm very aware that every woman is different and we're not Stepford wives, we're not robots, and we don't all bleed the same, and everybody has a different experience. So my normal is not the same as somebody else's normal, and then partners have never had that, so they wouldn't know. And I guess it's not just for women listening to this podcast, but also for the men or the partners in their lives who can say, actually, I think you might have some of these symptoms. Actually, I'm seeing you every month having a really tough time.
Yes.
And it's really affecting you. And it actually is impacting your quality of life, because for a week of the month, or perhaps 2 weeks of the month, if you've got PMS for a week and then you have your period for a week, actually that's half the month that you're really struggling with your menstrual cycle, and only half the month that you can actually go off and enjoy yourself and feel yourself, feel like you. So actually it's being really aware of that, I think, and it doesn't have to necessarily be partners. It could be that you're listening to this and thinking, oh, my friend was saying that she's really suffering, or my daughter, or my sister.
I've over the years done presentations for members of the public, so women who've got endometriosis but they've brought their husband or partner along with them, and it's always really interesting to hear them talk. And I think the thing to get across is that, and not to like overcomplicate it, but it's like that men trying to explain to them that it's not just about maybe the menstrual actual bit, so that could be maybe bad in itself, but them understanding that you might be suffering from quite extreme fatigue, or you're in a lot of pain everywhere else. I mean, I meant to mention earlier around the NICE guidelines, anything involving any type of pelvic pain or discomfort as well, which might not even be menstrual related. Certainly where it can get difficult is women talking about painful sex. So this is where like it can become issues in relationships. I almost think where the couples are not communicating or talking together like properly, because I would say in so many situations I've been so heartwarmed by how amazing these husbands and boyfriends are. Funny enough, I've met a ton of husbands and boyfriends who are much better than I would say the women at going, right, I've read about endo diets and I've done the shopping for the week and we're not going to have any of this and I've thrown the sugar out of the house, and they're so good. They just want to help their partner. So I think actually talking about it and them understanding how it is, and them also coming to appointments with you. So I have a lot of clients where I say, bring your husband or boyfriend to the appointment, go and talk to the surgeon with him, go and see the GP with your husband or boyfriend, just because also when you're in a lot of pain and you've got a lot going on, you know how it is, your head is like this. So sometimes it's helpful to have, if you're asked a question about something like, do you have this, do you have that, it can be helpful that there's another person there, like a partner or husband, who then says, well, actually, you're saying it's not as bad as you think it is. I've noticed that 6 times this month you said that this has been like this. Or did you know that this has occurred, like, or I've really noticed you struggling, even though you say you're fine. And that can be really helpful to have someone who's there to kind of advocate for you as well, for sure.
Yeah. Again, coming back to that normalisation part as well. If there's one thing that you would like women hearing this to take away from this conversation, what would it be?
I think my main big thing in my soapbox is don't leave all this until you want to get pregnant, and don't normalise too much symptoms that I think we do at the back of our head know. Humans are pretty cool. I think with the gut, it's the wrong phrase because you can get gut issues, but you know, the concept of the gut feeling of something like, I don't think this is very normal, we're often very right. And I think, like I said, looking at the NICE guidelines for endometriosis, looking at other symptoms you've got, particularly if they're involving anything involving the gut, inflammation, your immune system. By the way, musculoskeletal issues are a big area in endometriosis, and you get a big crossover with things like connective tissue disorders. So even women who've got endo might say that they have lots of injuries. So, or takes a long time to heal from sports injuries or just normal things. So this is why I'm saying you might want to draw up a big list of stuff you've got going on and see how they interconnect together. And I have to be careful how I put this because I don't want to sound like I'm not appreciating people's economic position, but if you're not getting the help that you need from your NHS GP, please to at least go and have a consultation with a private gynecologist. And I'm very lucky because I refer, and I have referrals from some of the best in the UK, and there are some really truly fantastic doctors out there who've spent their entire career focusing on endometriosis and the related areas with that, and it can be for the same cost, by the way, as you going away for the weekend and staying in a hotel and going out for dinner and buying a nice dress. You could have had a life-changing consultation. So I know that that's not for everyone's budget, but I do think that if you're just getting fed up with the NHS route, or it just feels like it's a bit slow, at least have a look at the other side. And certainly, by the way, there are lots of people I have conversations with who already have private insurance. This is a really common conversation. I go, do you have private insurance? Oh yeah, I do actually. And you're like, okay, you could go and see a gynecologist like literally next week. But you and I talk about this often, don't we? If you fell over and you hurt your knee, we're so much better at going and dealing with the knee, aren't we?
Yeah.
Than we are around those.
External that you can see.
External that you can see, yeah. This is why I said going back to visualizing, and I'm really making what I've watched live surgery, so it's more complicated than this, but I'm trying to make it simple for listeners. But just imagine you have a burn from the oven, or you'll remember this in the olden days of going clubbing when people smoked in clubs. You end up with a cigarette burn on your shoulder because I'm short, so someone's smoking above you. Like what that looks like and feels like on a bigger, more complicated scale, like on the inside, and that, can you imagine all the knock-on effects that's going to kind of create? So take someone with you for an NHS appointment, make yourself aware of some of the symptoms, make a symptom diary, think about things that you think are not connected but they possibly could be, and then also, if you can afford it, think about going and having a chat with a really good gynecologist to sort of speed things up as well. Just not leaving things.
Yeah. Don't fall into the 8-9 year
no,
diagnosis.
and by the way, don't you think you'd rather be wrong?
Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. Don't you think you go, oh, okay, it's not that, because it's a rounding down. So I think that is my that's my kind of take home. And I think really understanding is that it's more than just a hormone or gynae issue. It is kind of expansive, and that's where the really interesting research comes into play and links back into nutrition. So it's a really ever evolving area that's very, I hate to say exciting because it's obviously an awful thing, but very passionate about women getting better and getting the help that they need. And I think the more that we understand it, then the more that we can get there quicker as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think so much of that is awareness. As you say, it affects so many women, and so many people do not know about it or how to attribute their symptoms to it and get help.
Yes.
So I'm really hoping that as a result of this conversation, that if someone gets a diagnosis or goes and speaks and has that conversation with their doctor about the NICE guidelines, then it's absolutely worth it.
Yeah, I think also the last thing to say is that probably someone listening to what I'm about to say will probably nod their heads on this. If you think you've got endo and you're now missing work quite a lot, it's worth going and talking to HR, because HR these days now have to be more aware of things like endometriosis, and it's much better to be having an open dialogue conversation, because also it's so stressful if you're missing work or you're behind on work, and then it really can eat away at you, because there's such a big mental effect from endometriosis. You know, issues with work, issues with family, issues with caring for children. If you talk to women who've got really bad endo, and will tell you they're having a really bad endo flare, but you've got a toddler and a 6-year-old who are running around screaming, when all you really want to do is go back to bed. So it's like, that's why I'm saying even making your family more aware, so that you can call your Auntie Jane saying, I'm having a really difficult day. Would you be a sweetheart and come round and take them off my hands for a couple of hours so I could have a hot bath and go and sleep for a bit? So I think getting people to understand that you've got really quite a serious situation that's not the same as just having period pain. So now I have to be more aware of it, and all the really good stuff that charities like Endo UK and parliamentary committees do towards, a big part of that is also so that the workforce is more aware, and that they don't just go, wow, she's having another day off because she's got period pain.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, exactly. Because actually, I didn't talk about my endometriosis for a long time.
Do you mean with family or
With anyone?
With anyone, yeah. Friends of yours?
No, not at all. I didn't talk about it. And it wasn't until I kept cancelling plans, and I felt that so bad for the fact that I was being really flaky. I was like, I'm going to have to explain why I'm doing this. And it's not just because I'm a flaky friend, but actually because I've got something that I'm dealing with. And the moment I did, it made it so much easier.
Yes.
And I don't know why I had this sort of shame about it, really, and not wanting to discuss it, because as you say, you know, it's a disease. It's something that does impact your life.
I think it's hard to talk about, because I think quite rightly, why would you want to tell Uncle Bob about your heavy periods? I think if with other things, it's easier to talk to people, and so I think it can be difficult because it's like quite an intimate disease to have. Like, you don't want to. By the way, I didn't come to your friend's birthday party because I can't get off the toilet, because I have hours of IBS because I've got endometriosis and I can't move. You know, it's much harder. I think much harder, by the way, than saying I have depression, and if I've got bad depressive days, I can't come. That is almost, I would say, in some circumstances, is almost easier. So I think that partly it's a tricky one, because it's a bit of an intimate one in lots of ways.
I think the other thing as well is it's often so linked to fertility, as you say, and that's when people find out
about
it. So you
have
fertility issues, and therefore it's linked to that. So there's sort of that shame of that, and you don't want to discuss it. So, but having then come out and said I have endometriosis, I found it so much easier now to be able to talk about it, and to have the support, and to ask for the support, and to have the understanding from other people of when I can and can't do things.
I give you an example. I've got a lovely best friend who has endo, and she's had really good treatment, and that's been really great, and we do lots of nutritional things that I help her with, but she will still have difficult times. And because I'm very aware of her having it, we have all these conversations that will be like, oh, plan a trip together, and she goes, oh, can we look at those dates, because I'd rather just not be away when I've got my period. And I go, absolutely fine. Or we have fun conversations like this, because she's going on dates. And she's like, I've scheduled my dates so that I've not got my period, or like this. And also including, by the way, So she's a good example. So if she has alcohol near her period, she will get a very bad migraine, and then she'll also get really bad period pain, because the whole histamine, migraine, hormones kind of thing is all sort of mixed up. So she will plan a date also because she'd like to have a cocktail. So the more that your friends also, and we can have a laugh about it, like you can make it a point of humour, like, oh no, he wants to come and stay over, but that's my period day. No, I'm like, then he has to come next week. So that really, the more that you inject some humour into it, and it becomes like that, then it becomes like less difficult to talk about, and you can normalise it for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lorna. It's always
My
an absolute
pleasure.
pleasure. And yeah, as I said, thank you again. You've been absolutely amazing throughout my own journey on this, and you're such an expert in this area. So thank you so much for giving up your time.
My
And we will
pleasure.
put those links in the show notes as well for people to find them, and the nice
Thank
guidelines
you for
as well.
having me on, and we could talk forever. It's so interesting, but such an important topic to talk about, particularly for this month as well. So
Absolutely.